It's time for a story. Are you ready? Here we go. There were two girls and a boy, and they were very good friends and neighbors, and they visited each other every day. In order to get to one another, they would walk through some backyards. One of those backyards belonged to Mr. Allium, and in his yard there was a very big, very beautiful garden. From the time these three were young, Mr. Allium had explained to them that these were his medicine plants, and he loved them very much, and he wanted them treated very gently, and please walk around the garden. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they forgot. And if Mr. Allium found them forgetting and walking through the garden, he would come out and explain to them one more time that the plants need to be treated with great respect. They need gentleness. Please, don't step on the plants. And they would try their best to remember, but it was such a big garden and it was such a long walk around. And sometimes they just thought maybe he wasn't looking, and they would do it anyway. And if he found them, he would give them a grumpy face and explain it to them again. Now, one day, the three children persuaded their parents to let them camp out in the woods. Behind one of their homes, there was a big, big woods, and they had built a wonderful shelter, and now they'd packed their backpacks with their sleeping bags and with sit-upons and with dinner food and lunch food, and they were going out to the woods. And now they were going to walk through Mr. Allium's yard. And their packs were heavy, and they thought, oh, I don't want to walk all the way around this yard. So they stopped at the edge, and they looked. They looked this way, they looked that way, just to see if they could see him anywhere, and they couldn't. And they said, okay, well, we'll try to stick to the paths in the garden. And they were making their way through the garden, stepping on, just only a plant here and there. And suddenly Mr. Allium, who had just been sitting low while he was weeding, stood up and was towering over them with his scowly face on. He said to them, I think that it is time for you three to learn something new about plants. And then he winked at them. Now, the three children looked at each other. Winking seemed friendly. What was going on? And then they started to feel a little funny, maybe a little dizzy. And they looked at the world around them and noticed that everything was getting bigger, much bigger, much, much, much bigger. And then they realized that they were getting smaller, much, much, much smaller, and that they were actually now very tiny in a garden surrounded by very big plants, and looking up at Mr. Allium, who was now a giant. Mr. Allium crouched down beside them, and he said, when you learn to respect the plants, then you can be big again. Then he stood up and he whistled. And a cardinal came flapping down and landed right beside the children. Mr. Allium made a few more little chip, chip, chip noises to the cardinal. Then the cardinal used his beak to pick up one child by the back of his jacket, and the other two he picked up with his feet, and he took flight. He flew with them up over the garden, over a meadow, into the woods, and then flap, 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 flap. The cardinal came down and set down each child and flew away. One of the girls said, "Well, it's time that we learned how to respect the plants." And she found the nearest tree-like plant and started patting on the plant stem and saying, "I respect you. I respect you. I respect you very, very much." And the other two children did the same thing. They found plants and they patted them and they hugged them and they said, "We respect you. Oh, we respect you. We respect you very much, very, very much." And they waited, hoping that something would happen, but it didn't. "Well," they said to each other, "this is a survival situation." And they were actually a little bit excited about it because these three had been to nature class with each other every week for a long time, and they had learned a lot of useful things. "Okay," they said, "we've got to figure out our survival priorities. Let's see, what are they? Oh yeah. Fire, shelter, water, food. So fire, shelter, water, food. We have to figure out which one of those things we're going to take care of first." Okay, they remembered. We're supposed to figure out which one of them is the biggest need right now. Just at that moment, there was a tremendous clap of thunder, and a raindrop bigger than their heads thumped the ground right in front of them and splashed up into their faces. "Oh," they said, "shelter. Shelter is the most important thing right now." And they started to run. And then one of the girls said, "Hey, wait. We're not supposed to panic. We're supposed to stop and look around and calm down and think." Well, that was a little bit tricky because a few more raindrops had started to patter down. But they looked around and they saw May-apples. Now, if you've never seen a May-apple, I should tell you what it looks like. There's a tall stem, and then there are leaves like an umbrella. The children ran toward the May-apples, and they got there just as the rain picked up, and they found one really big May-apple with an umbrella-like leaf big enough to shelter all of them. And each of them leaned back against the trunk-like stem of the May-apple and felt completely protected under its shelter. They watched the rain fall. It was fascinating to see drops that big. And it wasn't a very long storm. It was over in just a short while. So they hugged the May-apple trunk and they told it, thank you very much." "Now let's see, what's next?" they said. And the boy said, I'm hungry, but what can we eat? All the plants we learned that we can eat, I can see a few of them right now, but they're so big, I don't think I could even take a bite out of them with my mouth being as little as it is." And then one of the girls said, "Oh, you know what? Hey, we could eat some pollen, but we've got to find a plant that's safe to eat." All right, so they all began to look around at all the plants they could see. And then the boy said, "I see a dandelion." And they were very excited because it was still quite early in the springtime and there were almost no dandelions anywhere. But they saw this dandelion, and so they ran over to it. "Now, how are we going to get that dandelion?" they said. "That dandelion it's tall like a palm tree." Well, they tried climbing, and they were able to climb the leaves a bit, and they were able to climb up the stalk a little bit. The flower was leaning over just a little bit, and then they figured out that they could boost someone up, and someone could climb enough onto the stem to put their weight on it and make it lean down, and then the others could collect handfuls of pollen, and they collected enough pollen that they could all eat. And it tasted pretty good, actually. They really liked that meal, and their bellies were full. They felt good. Well, that's shelter and food, and they realized that the sun was setting and it was starting to get pretty chilly. Fire, they said. Hey, fire. And then they remembered that their backpacks had not been shrunk with them, and all the fire gear was in their backpacks. Now what are we going to do? They said. Oh, I sure wish I'd practiced bow drill, said one of the girls, and gosh, I can't think of a way to make fire really quickly right now with no equipment. And even if we could make fire, we'd be burning like dry grass and little tiny sticks from dry plant stems. And could we even keep a fire that small going? And oh, what are we going to do now? And then the boy said, oh, wait a minute. I was just reading about this. There's a plant in our area that makes its own heat. Skunk cabbage. Skunk cabbage. It comes up really, really early. It has a flower that comes up really early, and sometimes it has to melt snow. So it makes its own heat, and they're stinky. And that's why they have to get out a stinky smell, because that calls in all the insects that pollinate it. So it'll probably smell really bad, said the boy, but if we could find a skunk cabbage, it might keep us warm. Where do skunk cabbages like to live? Oh yeah, they like wet places. And there's a wet place in the forest at the back of Mr. Alliam's property. The north part of his property, the north. How do we find north? There's the sun, said one of the girls. Just going down over there, so that's got to be west, so that's got to be north. So they walked in the north direction, and the ground got damper and squishier. And then the boy said, there it is, there it is. And they saw it. A purplish, greenish, speckly skunk cabbage blossom, bigger now than any of them. And as they got closer to the blossom, yes, indeed, it was smelly. So they plugged their noses until they got used to the smell, and they came closer to it, and they climbed inside the blossom, and it was warm in there. Yes, it was warm in there. And they pushed their feet up against that spadix in the middle of it, and they leaned their backs against the inside wall of the flower. And it was so cozy in there, they all just fell asleep, and they stayed asleep all night long. Oh, and by, they just felt the light coming back into the world, and they felt their shoulders going all like that as they began to wake themselves up. They'd had a good night's sleep, and they climbed out of that that skunk cabbage blossom, and immediately all three of them realized that they were very terribly thirsty. Water, they said, and they remembered to pat the skunk cabbage blossom and to thank it very, very much for a good night's sleep. And now we need water. What are we going to do? They stamped their feet a little bit, and they remembered that the ground was squishy, and they looked at it, and the water was all muddy. And they thought, well, it might be dirty. It might have bacteria in it that could make us sick. We probably shouldn't drink this water right on the ground. But dew might be okay. They had collected dew in nature class. Let's see, we need a plant that is not poisonous to collect dew. And so they looked around, and right away they found some moss. And they remembered that moss is like a sponge. Moss is always full of water. So they went close to the moss. Oh, it was amazing to look at it when it was just about their size. Yes, the moss was even a little taller than them, and it looked like a knotty, tangly, green, bushy forest. And the leaves of the moss had water sitting on them. And the children were able to reach out and cup water in their hands and to drink. And they just felt so good. They had everything they needed. And they just stroked the leaves of the moss and thanked the moss. And then they looked at each other and they said, plants are amazing. All of our needs have been met by plants. We are going to have to really take care of plants from here on out. And as soon as that was said, something came running toward them. Boing, 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 boing. It was a mouse that was bigger than them. And the mouse came very close to them and laid down on its belly and put out its paws, and put its face down on its paws, and just relaxed and twitched its tail a little bit. And the children watched the mouse. They watched its body language. They watched it looking at them. And they thought, it's not afraid of us. It doesn't seem like it wants to hurt us. And then one of the girls went over and touched it. And she said, oh, its fur is so soft. And then the other girl said, hey, I think it wants us to climb on top. And she did that. She gently took some handfuls of mouse fur and she climbed on top and she sat on the mouse. And the other girl got up behind her and the boy behind them, and they sat there on the mouse. And the mouse stood up and wiggled a little bit as though to tell them, you better hang on. So they hung on and the mouse took off. Boing, 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 boing. And they watched the forest just zip past them, and they watched the meadow fly past them, and they watched garden plants starting to show up around them, and they realized that they were nearly back where they had started. And then the mouse stopped and shivered once again, and all three slid off, and they smelled freshly turned dirt and the smell of hyacinths. And they looked up, and there was giant Mr. Allium. And he looked down at them and said, so it seems that you have learned how to respect the plants. And then he winked at them. And they had that funny feeling again, almost a little bit dizzy. And now they just felt themselves getting bigger. And everything else, they could see it getting smaller. And they grew and they grew and they grew until they were full-sized again. And oh, they felt great. Whew, they said. Wow. And Mr. Allium, well, he squatted down so that he was at the same height as them, so he could look them in the eye. And he said, I bet you have an amazing story to tell. And the children said, we sure do. And then they said, our parents will never believe us if we tell them this story. They'll tell us it was just a dream. But I would believe it, said Mr. Allium. Why don't you tell me? And so they did. And that is the end of the story.